Tradeshift, we help connect companies so they can trade together, right? So if you think about modern supply chains, you might be a huge company like Unilever and you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of suppliers all over the world you do business with. And before Tradeshift, a lot of that business was done on paper, fax, spreadsheets. And what we do is we build a giant cloud network, almost like a Facebook or LinkedIn, but for businesses, connecting them, linking them up, and allowing them to trade on that platform so everything can happen electronically. And today we connect more than 1.5 million companies. We do around $300 billion of direct trade and probably another 200 billion indirect. And we operate in 120 countries. So we have a very good view of what's flowing through the pipes, so to speak, of global trade. There's been a lot of data around what happens to GDP in a pandemic like this. And I think we see those numbers come in from the economists. What we thought would be interesting was to take a look at all of the transactions that precedes that, right? So, if there's a purchase order in Q2, that becomes GDP in Q3, right? And the same with invoices. There's a lag between the trade happens and you can see that in the GDP. So in a way, we felt like we had an early insight into what was happening. And by taking a look at the global network, we could definitely see some very interesting trends, right? I mean, global trade was down almost 19% in second quarter, which obviously was a massive amount. But what's also interesting was a lot of the countries that had done very strict lockdowns, you saw the purchase ordering volume start coming up again, which is a sign that some confidence is returning to some of the business in those areas. Look, a lot of the business software that we run on an everyday basis, if you work for a company, we sit in front of a screen, is of course digital. But what happens below that, like deep down in the mailroom or somewhere else, is very often manual. And I think one of the key insights from this pandemic is you cannot build your house on a weak foundation, right? So if you have, depending on a shared service center where workers have to come in and scan invoices as they come in the paper and put them into a machine, well, if everybody's at home, that don't work. I had CFOs calling from very large companies saying, we have 1 million invoices sitting in our shared services, and we're about to report our quarterly results. So I think there's been sort of a huge awakening to the fact that we really need to digitize all the way out to the last link and sort of get the foundation for our house in order. And I see cloud computing, I see machine learning to automate a lot of decisions rather than having a lot of humans to make all of those decisions. They're going to be massive drivers, and we're going to be moving from a trend where we looked at what's on the surface a lot to really looking at what's in the foundations. And that's what we've seen across the board with our customer base. History don't move in flat curves, right? It moves in giant shifts. And there's sort of a pile up to a point where the change happens. And I mean, if you look across the board, I mean, the pandemic is going to change so many different things around technology. We're already seeing, I mean, right now we are, on a Zoom call or, over video right here. And the fact that workers can do that from all over the world for so many companies, it's going to change the global real estate market, right? If you look at, commuting between cities, we have 2 cars. We don't have a need for 2 cars anymore, right? Because we're working from home. I think if you look at just inside business, right? I mean, it's very clear you need to be able to organize your companies in a whole different way. And if the foundation is not digital, that's going to be very hard. So there's a lot of course, terrible things happening around the pandemic. But what is really great is that we're re-examining a lot of the beliefs we held before because we're being challenged, right? So it's almost like if you're forced to reevaluate one belief, you can reevaluate all of them. And I think that's going to help us a lot when it comes to renewable energy, digitizing processes, allowing people to have more flexible work terms. All of these things, I think, good things that might come out of this if I was to run my optimist hat. If you think about people sitting in front of a screen saying yes, no to something, if you think about data input typing stuff, a lot of that is going to go away because it's simply just too big a risk to have that in your supply chain. And before, you would look at it as a cost. You would say, okay, maybe we can afford this, but that's not the problem when you have a risk. In the risk scenario, you cannot afford it because your business will stop. And so I think, AI and machine learning was already really hot before, but sort of people were like, is it going to come now? It's going to be, the next 10 years, I'm going to have another AI winter. But that's coming big time. And it's coming really, really big into the business processes of most companies today. And I think that's going to be a very big driving trend. I think the other big trend that we are seeing is marketplaces, right? And we've seen that as consumers. It's very clear that, Amazon has had, probably the best half year ever. It's, you sit at home, what do? We order stuff. But that is also true for companies. Companies are more and more putting up B2B marketplaces and building their own versions of Amazon, essentially, rather than when they trade with each other, not with consumers, right? And that's a whole new evolution as well. I think if you look at sort of just technology for the home, right? We've seen this explosion in video conferencing, how we work. I think how we think about our work life, how we schedule it. And I think another thing actually that might happen is a lot more of us might be freelancers in the future. Because if we are working from home, if our job interface is digital, you could work for 3 or 4 companies easily and do the same thing, right? So I think there's going to be a very interesting thing we saw early on with like the Ubers and Lyft of this world, where it became like work platforms, happen to a lot of other jobs, maybe also much more high earning jobs, because people get the flexibility when they work from home that they don't have if they have to go to the same office. It's kind of hard to work for 4 companies if you have to be in the office. I think it's a sort of great thing. I mean, for the last 40 years, the economy has been extremely stable. There's very, very few variations. Even the dot-com bubble was not very big at 2008 compared to the past, right? And we probably got lulled a little bit into sleep because most of our infrastructure, most of our services are set up to be very hard to change. It's very hard to change the supply chain. It's very hard to change the way we produce a car. But it's very low cost. It's cheap because we expect, in a way you can say business that subsidize the cost of a stable world to governments. And when we don't have a stable world, we really need to have much lower cost of change. We need to be able to adapt much quicker. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest sort of drivers for how we design and build businesses in the future. It needs to be extremely flexible, it needs to be extremely adaptable. And I mean, business leaders I see across the board, they're making those choices right now. And that requires that you have a much more flexible architecture for your business, essentially. We have learned so many good lessons, right? We thought we were a remote company. We started out essentially as a remote company 10 years ago. We had people working all over the world. We've had people working all over the world for the last 10 years. Today we have 1,000 people. We're still doing that. But when we sent everybody home and we didn't have anybody in the offices, we found out that there was sort of a class difference between the people who are remote and the people who are in the offices, right? You have a tendency, maybe if you're in a meeting room, that is one screen with everybody who's remote, and everybody sits and talk. And sometimes you talk over the person who's remote because it's kind of hard to get into the conversation. And what we found out as we're working from home, all of us now, all of these ways to make life better for everyone, like to make space for conversations so everybody can, participate. We found out, actually we take more care of each other. There's a lot more empathy in the company, and because everybody is in a situation that's we don't know the context. Like one thing I think that's amazing that's happened, right, is, just last week I was on a call with some very serious investment bankers, and my 5-year-old son, he runs in and want to play Jurassic Park, right? And I mean, in the old days, in the business context, you would kind of hide your family life, you kind of hide your private life. And I think there's a lot more, everybody just laughed, right? Because everybody of us know the same could happen to us, right? So I think those are some of the really interesting things we've seen happen, and I hope that stay on.